Today, we're going to find out whether you're faster with lower FPS or higher FPS on F122. So you may have seen recently then that the league race has been blowing up on social media, talking about how if you run lower frame rates, you can actually ride the curbs more around Monza, obviously potentially providing a competitive advantage. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into all the things that could possibly change with the frame rate. And actually this is the deepest dive that I've ever done on the F1 games. I've done about 15 separate tests or so. So we're going to find out truly once and for all whether you should be running lower frame rate or higher frame rate if you're looking for every thousandth of performance. Let's get into it. Okay, here's my first laps playing at 180 frames per second after being very used to playing at 60 frames per second. What I'll say straight away is that it feels a lot smoother. That's obviously not a surprise. It feels so much smoother. No notable differences so far, I've got to say, on the physics. Doesn't feel any different. I mean, I think it's the smoothness that's going to take me a couple of laps to get used to. We're 3/10 down already, obviously, but no noticeable differences right now. Now, the fact that most esports players run very high frames per second and get world records suggests to me that the grip will not be worse. If anything, it will be better at higher frame rate compared to at 60 FPS. I've got to say that over the bumps, which is the biggest difference I was expecting, it's not noticeably different. I mean, it's slightly different, I'd say. But again, is that just down to purely how smooth the game is? There's maybe a touch more grip, but that could well be placebo. Knowing that these sports players go very quickly on their settings, it could be me looking for that. Because again, I've got to say, the feel, other than obviously being smoother, it is nice that it's smoother. There's no doubt about that. It is certainly nicer being nice and silky smooth. Overall, it's not much different. Okay. The feel is very, very similar. The smoothness is by far the biggest thing on the feel. But let's do a sweat it up now, see if we can go any quicker than that. And also then let's do a few more tests after that. Okay, so we actually managed to improve our PB with the higher frame rate. Now, that's not necessarily the be all and end all. So what I'm going to do here is the reverse. And I'm going to do the same thing, but with 60 FPS. Now, I will say straight away, I think there may be a difference in the corner cutting. I feel like I'm able to cut that final turn a bit more. The differences are minor, but maybe the difference is just purely smoothness. Honestly, pure grip-wise, physics-wise, so damn similar. Let's do a bit more scientific tests, because honestly, so far it's so hard to judge. And I tell you what, for triple the FPS, if there is physics differences, they've got them to be tiny. If I had to decide right now before we do any scientific tests, I'd say the physics differences are absolutely minimal, and the differences are purely down to how smooth it is, because the differences are that small, and the physical smoothness is definitely the biggest factor that I'm seeing. Let's do some more scientific tests now. Well, there we go then. We had some interesting theories come up there, but for the most part wasn't too much different. So let's do a deep dive into some more kind of less variable tests, I suppose. Rather than just involving me driving it as good as I can, we're going to try and isolate as many variables as possible to do some tests. So in order to do those then, we're going to use flashbacks wherever we possibly can. That's just to guarantee we're at the same point at the same track, doing the same speed, everything's pretty much the same. We can just do the test over and over and over again with almost exactly the same parameters. We're also mainly going to be using time trial, because once again, that just takes out a load of variables. So things like temperature are completely not simulated in time trials. That just again allows us to concentrate completely just purely on the frame rate and the physics. And my first tests are going to be run at both 60 FPS, because that's what I normally run anyway, so I should be able to drive that quite well, and also that's obviously fairly smooth, and also 180 FPS, just like we ran just in that test just there, so triple the frame rates. Hopefully we'll notice some differences in some of these tests. In this one then, I'm going to take you on a little journey through the tests, so you are going to discover these tests just like I did in real time when I did them. So I'm not going to do any conclusions throughout the video unless I'm absolutely certain from that particular test, and then we'll conclude it all at the end. So the first test then is going to concentrate on Monza, and down at turn 4. This is a test you've probably seen on social media. This is the corner in particular that blew it up amongst league racers, and we're trying it on 60 versus 180 frames per second. Now, we actually did find straight away that we could definitely take the curb easier running 60 FPS versus 180. Definitely a consistent difference. So we can already pretty much conclude that you can ride certain curbs easier with lower frame rates, but of course that is not the end of that. But within this test, we actually made a huge discovery then. In stopping on top of the sausage curb, so the car is effectively beached on top of that sausage curb, we actually found that when we were changing the frame rate, the car was raising and lowering when it was completely stationary. Now this is huge because this should hopefully point us a lot more to what is possibly changing. Now my previous theory was that probably the higher frame rate was just detecting the curb more, so it was detecting it every, let's say, I don't know, 10 centimeters, whereas a lower frame rate was only detecting every 30 centimeters, let's say. But that is not the case at all. So the next test then is just going to be to go completely full throttle on Spain. Now I've done these tests before when I was trying to see if a human player could beat traction control, and we found actually some slight differences. Interestingly, we did seem to get slightly better traction. Again, we're completely flooring it, but we did seem to get slightly better traction running higher frame rates this time. But the differences were very, very minor. But the reason I'm just flooring it is because that takes out my ability to try and do a start. And it just tries to show us exactly how much grip we're getting when we're completely spinning the tyres. The only other thing we noticed from this early test is that the rev limiter actually sounds a little bit different. So we're finding some more differences here. Higher FPS possibly has better traction. Too early to fully conclude that yet, but also there was definitely some different sounds with the rev limiters, so we'll do some future tests on that. But before we do those, the next test I did was to try and do an actual start myself. So rather than just going full throttle, just try to get the best possible traction I could using, of course, the throttle pedal on my wheel. With this, I found no real differences, to be honest. From 1 kilometer an hour, which is where I started the test, up to 160 kilometers an hour, which is where we stopped being traction limited, it didn't seem to make any difference what frame rate I was running. There seemed to be maybe a very slight advantage for lower FPS, but to be honest, it was such a small margin of error. As it's me myself trying to press the throttle pedal, we can't really draw any conclusions from that. So it doesn't appear to be certainly not any big advantage in terms of pure traction off the line. The next test then was to see how we fared after we were no longer traction limited. So this is effectively a power test or a drag test or a top speed test or a straight line speed test, probably is a better way of putting it. So with this one, we went from when we weren't traction limited, which was 160 kilometers an hour, right the way up to 290 kilometers an hour, which was just before turn 1 at Spain. With this, interestingly, we did seem to see that the lower frame rate seemed to have a fairly consistent advantage. Now, again, this advantage was absolutely tiny, but the reason I even say that it's a possible advantage and it's not necessarily within the margin of error was because there was no real human aspect to this. Yes, I was shifting the gears, but I was doing it very consistently. There was no traction issues. I wasn't trying to turn the wheel. There was no real thing other than the frame rate that was different in between the tests. So even though it was a small margin of just 2 or 3 frames or so, but between the test for lower frame rate and higher frame rate, there definitely seemed to be a very slight straight line speed advantage for lower FPS. So this brings us on then to our second round of tests. So those previous ones then, I did those as a batch. I then went away, analysed all my runs and got the conclusions that I've just given you just there. But the second run, I'm actually going to make the FPS difference bigger. So this time we're going to be running 30 frames per second on the lower end, and we're going to be running over 200 frames per second. We're actually not limiting the frame rate anymore, and that sees us go something like 220 up to 250 frames per second, depending on various variables, but a much bigger difference now between the frames. So hopefully we should see a big difference as well in our test. Now the first test to do was just the wheel spin test again. Again, takes out a lot of variables. I could just floor the throttle and we could do a wheel spin test. So from 1 to 100 kilometers an hour, just like before. And once again, we found a very small but consistent nonetheless differences in favor of higher frame rate. So it seems when you're wheel spinning, you can get a very slight advantage if you're running a higher frame rate. Again, can't yet conclude that you have better traction for higher frame rate, but there definitely did seem to be some quite consistent differences there. So with that in mind then, we need to figure out if higher frames per second really does have an advantage in terms of possible straight line speed. So the way we're going to do that is to isolate out all the traction issues. So we're going to switch over to Baku because that is one of the few tracks where we can reach an absolute VMAX speed, which is the fastest possible speed the car will go, so it just won't accelerate anymore. And actually with that, we found absolutely identical runs between 30 FPS and over 200 FPS. They both reached the exact same top speed, no differences at all. So with that, we can confidently conclude that there is no differences with power and drag So with different frame rates running, there's no differences between engine power and drag, not at all. We can completely conclude that now, but we're still seeing those slight differences in terms of the full throttle test. So the next one then was just to try the tyre temps. So we're now switching over to Grand Prix mode. We're letting the tyres cool all the way down to their minimum. We're then up against the wall and just flooring the throttle. Again, this so we can get a perfect test. We're also holding it in first gear so the wheels always spin at the same speed. And once again, we actually found absolutely zero differences between 30 frames per second and over 200 frames per second. They warmed up at absolutely identical speeds. There was no difference at all in the tyre warm, which is certainly a good thing. So no differences in that. The next one then was to investigate the rev limiter differences that we were hearing when we were just flooring the throttle. They weren't massive differences, but I did notice them even when I was recording it live. So let's figure out what's going on with that. Well, what I actually found was that, interestingly, the lower frame rates you run, the more consistent the rev limiter is. Now, what I mean by that is when I was running 30 frames per second, the revs seem to be pretty much locked to the rev limiter of 13,000 revolutions per minute RPM in the engine. When I ran over 200 FPS, that was a lot less consistent. Now, you'd assume it'd be the other way around, so it's an interesting one. But it was bouncing between 13,000 and about 12,800 or so. So it's about 200 RPM difference that it was bouncing between. So that was an interesting difference, which is why we were hearing differences. And I believe that is why we were getting a very slight difference when we were absolutely flooring the throttle off the line, just purely the rev limiter. So what it was doing was when we had higher FPS, the rev limiter was bouncing between 13,000 and 12,800 RPM, and that was just causing the wheels to spin very, very slightly less sometimes, down to 12,800 RPM, causing us to get a little bit more traction because the wheels weren't spinning quite so fast. Whereas when we were running lower FPS, the wheels were consistently spinning at the fastest they could possibly spin, so they were just spinning a bit quicker, and we were essentially getting a bit more wheel spin running the lower FPS. So I believe that is the differences there that we were seeing with the full throttle test. So we conclude that relatively confidently. We can never be absolutely certain with any of these tests because, there's lots of variables involved. But I believe we have now got to the bottom of the differences we found in that full throttle speed test. So next up then, we need to test the curbs. This is of course what we saw in Monza and what all the league races have found. So my first one actually was to test, other than that Italy one, was to test the Abu Dhabi curb at the end of the back straight. Because I've actually found previously when I've been racing against Team Marduk here in the two-player career mode, that sometimes when I'm hitting the brakes, I'm getting bounced by the curb and it never seems to happen to Ben. So I noticed there was a difference there. So what I just did was I went full throttle down the straight and just ran over that curb. Now, what we found was, interestingly, that the higher frame rate was definitely way smoother over that curb. When I was running lower frame rate, when I was running 30 frames per second, the car was bouncing more and it was certainly feeling a lot more bouncy through the wheel. It was making a big difference actually. It was really jolting me around through the wheel. Whereas higher frame rate, that wasn't happening at all. The curb was feeling a lot smoother. It's still feeling a little bit bumpy, but a lot smoother. Quite a big difference, but I wasn't sure with that test whether that was just force feedback differences or whether that was the actual car making a difference. So the next test then was to jump on Eau Rouge at Spa. Now I know, again, I normally run 60 FPS. I know that it's super bumpy up through Eau Rouge on my normal game when I raced it previously, and it's honestly awful. It's just too bumpy. You bounce it around everywhere, and it's not going to say difficult to control, but it's not a very pleasant experience up through Eau Rouge. Yeah, we saw exactly that on 30 frames per second. When I increased it though up to 100 or over 200 frames per second, it was way smoother, way night and day smoother up through Eau Rouge. Now, I was initially thinking possibly it's just a force feedback thing, and you can clearly see there is a difference with the force feedback. The wheelies move around loads more, but I actually don't think it's a difference with the force feedback. I think the force feedback runs at a rate that is separated from the frame rate. We'll get into that stuff in a little while. But I actually believe it was because the car was bouncing more, so the force feedback was then reacting just because the car was bouncing more. Because if you look at it really closely, you can see that physically the sky or the trees are bouncing around more when we're on lower frames per second. Then on higher frames per second, when it was fairly smooth up through that. It still obviously bounces. Those bumps still exist physically on the track that we're being affected by on lower frame rates. So definitely, I can pretty firmly conclude there that higher frame rates benefit from a much smoother experience. The lower frame rate you run, the more you're affected by undulations, whether they be curbs or bumps in the track. Makes actually, certainly on a wheel, quite a significant difference. The force feedback is actually night and day difference between low and high FPS. So we found a few suspension differences then. Hard to draw exact conclusions on what we found, but there've definitely been some differences with how the suspension interacts with the track. So the next one then was just to test the cornering speed. Now it took me a while to figure out how to do this as good as possible. What I did was I switched the pad, I used flashbacks and I switched the pad just to get the perfect steering angle. Otherwise it was relying on me turning the wheel a very specific amount, which is very hard to do. Whereas the pad, I could just press the stick all the way and let the game figure out how much to turn and obviously stay full throttle. So we're doing that. I actually didn't find any differences at all in the high-speed cornering around France. The car just turned the same. Interestingly, every time I was flashing back, the car was washing out very slightly wider each time. That was not to do with the frame rate, but it didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever in terms of whether I was running high frame rate or low frame rate. So we can firmly conclude then that there is no cornering advantage whether you're running high FPS or low FPS, at least in the high speed. Next up then was to test the low speed cornering, which was pretty similar. It's the exact same corner actually of France. I'll just again use first gear as a kind of speed limiter. I just went around in one big circle, once again using pad to get the exact steering angle. And once again, we found no differences between low speed and low FPS and high FPS. It did make a difference. We were doing the same circles. Again, the circles were not perfect. It's a very hard thing to test actual cornering ability because there's a lot of variables in it. I feel like I've isolated them well enough though to conclude that there is also no differences whether you're running low FPS or high FPS in the cornering ability of your car at low speed. So high speed and low speed, no differences, high FPS to low FPS. The final test then is one I actually picked up earlier on, right at the start of the video, whereby it seemed to be that I could cut the corners more the lower frame rate I was running. And so we do a test around Kota, again using flashbacks, using a pad, so we're not steering, all we're doing is accelerating, the car is going dead in a straight line and we're flashing back. And we found absolutely 100% conclusive evidence that you can cut more corners with lower FPS, which is potentially a competitive advantage, of course. It was literally 100% ratio. Every single time I did the test on lower FPS, we were getting away with no warning. Every single time I did the test on higher FPS, we got a corner cut warning. Every single time. So I am 100% confident that there is an advantage to running lower FPS in terms of cutting corners. You can cut more corners the lower frame rate you're running, which is very interesting and not necessarily what I expected to see. That was a brand new one I found in testing for this video. Again, it's very hard to judge how much more you can cut. It's super hard to quantify this. All I really wanted to do was test whether it exists or not. And I can absolutely conclude that it does exist. How much more you can cut with the lower FPS you use, too many variables to test that in a scientific way. Well, there we go then. That is the end of the testing that I did with the different frame rates on F122. So what we can conclude then, the things that do not change with FPS, so whether you're running 30 FPS or over 200 FPS, things that do not change are traction, high speed cornering, low speed cornering, engine power, drag, and tyre temperatures. Now those are all pretty much the big ones. Those are the ones that could give you actually quite a big competitive advantage, whether you're running higher or lower FPS. So it's good to see that they are completely isolated. So I'm absolutely confident that almost all of the physics seems to run actually at 1000 Hertz. So this is some knowledge that I've gained over the years. It used to be back in the day, back in the F1 2013 days when I was league racing, that there was a difference with frame rate. So the physics engine ran on the frame rate that you were running. So if you were running 20 FPS versus running 200 FPS, there'd be quite a big difference because the physics engine would be running at 20 refreshes a second versus 200 refreshes a second. That is quite a big difference. They've now got rid of that for quite a few years now. A lot of the physics engine is running at 1000 Hertz. So it doesn't matter if you're running 20 FPS or 200 FPS, the physics engine is always running at 1000 Hertz. Now, it would appear that that doesn't apply to everything as we found out in this video, but that is why we're seeing that most of the traction and the high-speed cornering things are identical, because most of the physics engine is running at 1000 Hertz, but some of it is not. So the things then that are affected by FPS, so the things that do change whether you're running lower or higher FPS, mainly it seems to be the suspension. Now again, it's really hard to draw conclusions from this, but I would just say probably just the suspension itself, or maybe just one part of the suspension, or maybe even part of the game that detects like the ride height of the car or the way the car interacts with the track. I'm not too sure exactly what it is, but the closest I could boil it down to is suspension. So if I had to guess the one thing, it would be that suspension doesn't run at 1000 hertz. Suspension still runs at the game's refresh rate. But interestingly, if it is a suspension, it doesn't affect cornering performance. So I would suspect if the whole suspension was running at the game's refresh rate, then you'd see differences in the cornering performance, which we're not seeing. So it isn't quite so simple as that. But what we can conclude, though, is that the lower frame rates you're running, the better your car stays off the ground. We actually did another test at France, and we found that when off the edge of the track, just for the high-speed right-hand corner, we were finding that we were slowing down more the higher frame rate we ran. So effectively, your car runs lower to the ground when you're running higher frame rates. If you're running lower frame rates, your car runs a bit higher off the ground. I don't know if that's exactly what it is, but that effectively seems to be what it is, which is why we've seen the league races around Monza, the higher frame rate they ran, they hit the curb. I believe it's essentially to do with ride height, but I don't know exactly how it is more than that. Also, we conclude that the higher frame rates you run, over the curbs is a lot smoother, including the force feedback, but I think they're sort of interconnected. So if you're running a track that you use a lot of curb, I'm thinking something like Kota or Portimao, tracks where you're all over the curbs a lot, you actually want to run higher frames per second, I believe, because although you may bottom out a little bit more, unless you're completely bottoming out over the curb and literally spinning off the curb, you'll just have a much smoother ride over the curbs, and that will also affect the car's performance as well, because you can turn in smooth over the curbs and all that kind of thing. Whereas if you're running a circuit like Monza, where you don't tend to use the curbs that much other than trying to fly over a sausage curb, you do actually want to run lower frames per second because the car effectively runs a bit higher and you can go over the curbs. Again, I'm not actually sure if it is ride height, but that seems to be what it is. The other things then that are affected by FPS differences is corner cutting. So if you want to avoid corner cuts, lower your frame rate. The lower frame rate you run, the more corner cuts you can get away with. That was absolutely conclusive, but it's hard to draw any further conclusions other than that in terms of how much more you can get away with, but you could definitely get away with some more with lower FPS. The other thing is the rev limiter seemed to have a minor difference, but to be honest, it's a very minor difference. The lower FPS you run, the smoother the rev limiter is. Now, I of course did test the top speeds and stuff, so it's not the engine. The whole engine doesn't run at a different frame rate because then the power would change and things like that. So I'm not sure exactly what it is. My best guess is it's actually the transmission that runs at the game's refresh rate and not that 1000 hertz physics refresh rate, because that would also possibly explain why we seem to be sometimes a little bit quicker in a straight line. Possibly the gear changes happen a little bit faster, and it could be perhaps the rev limiter is actually in the transmission rather than the engine on the game. But I'm not too sure if it is the transmission that runs at various refresh rates. I'm not too sure what the knock-on effects of that would be. It didn't seem to make a big difference. There did seem to be absolutely minuscule straight line speed differences in favor of lower FPS, which again, it could just be to do with gear changes. I'm not too sure, but yeah. Well, there we go then, guys. That is all the differences that I managed to find with various frame rates on F122. As I mentioned, I believe that is all to do with some things run at the physics refresh rate, which is locked to 1000 hertz in the game, and some things run at your game's refresh rate. Obviously, things like visuals are totally fine to run at your game's refresh rate. There'd be no sense running the visuals at 1000, but obviously physics do need to be a lot more consistent. The reason I suspect that some things aren't running at 1000 is because they just haven't transitioned everything over, and the reason will be probably because of performance. I suspect you can't run the entire game at 1000 hertz no matter what, because it will just lag. There just isn't the performance, particularly in the last gen consoles, the PS4 and the Xbox One. There just isn't the performance, there isn't the power there within the console to run everything at 1000 hertz. That being said, with the findings in this video, if it does turn out that both the suspension and the transmission are running at the game's refresh rate rather than the physics refresh rate of 1000 hertz, maybe they have got the power headroom that they could do that, and maybe that could even be done with a patch. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see if they do react to these changes that have come out with the various differences between the frame rate. But hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video, and I thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and I'll catch you next time. Bye bye.